I am Nirajan Thapa and I am going to give a presentation on the Meta2 digital volume in the digital scriptorium, and it is based on the paper by Dave Long. First introduction. Meta2 was a compiler, which is to say that when one suspects a production compiler might be a rather large project to write an assembly, let alone library and open source compilers were still science fiction, then it makes sense to aim for an intermediate target, something small enough to be hand coded in assembly, yet powerful enough for writing that one had been aiming for the first place. Now, why should we study Meta 2? There is not much to examine. The another is there is not much to examine because its parts are already defined. It enables significant consequences. Digression. In examining medieval texts of horses, it is very clear that while equestrian has changed very little in the intervening centuries, veterinary science has made giant strides. With this distinction between art and technique in mind, and being thankful that Scott's text is, albeit in typewriter font, neither in medieval French nor horse words handwritten Freckot, we can take advantage of hindsight to separate the informatics for the technical artifacts of having run an IBM 1401. End of digression. Here is a smattering of more striking passages to be found. The one is, although sequences can be defined recursively, it is more convenient and efficient to have a special operator for this purpose. With hindsight, we smile and nod as we recognize the clean star CF of Thomson Construction Infra. These assemblies all have the same format, which is shown as level code addresses 1, 6, 8, 10, 12, 17, as you can see there. Repeated executions, whether recursive or externally initiated, result in a continued sequence of generated levels. Thus, all syntax equations contribute to one sentence. Meta 2. Meta 2 is a fine example of field improvised lever. One can see how the beam has been roughly attached to the fulcrum and feel how the entire structure may be spranger than one would like, but in the end, it serves to get the job done with a minimum of force, which is a good thing. Uh, we continue with. As Core himself notes, because of the fixed point nature of this process, it can, if one is fortunate, be forgiving of human error. Someone always asks if the compiler really produced exactly the program he had written by hand, and he had to say that it was almost the same program. He followed the syntax equations and tried to write just what the compiler was going to produce. Unfortunately, he forgot one of his redundant instructions, so the results were not quite the same. Of course, when the first machine-produced compiler compiled itself the second time, it reproduced itself exactly. The pipeline he set up was lexical analysis, that is unfolding the character by character input string to a sequence of tokens and literal strings. Syntax analysis, that is unfolding the linear lexical list into a syntax tree. Other is code generation in a syntax directed style and which is traditional. The notes, he was even more frugal when it came to numeric literals. The definition of number has been radically changed. The reason for this is to cut down on the space required by the machine subroutine which recognizes numbers. Compare Core's decisions with those taken in Chuck Norris programming, a problem-oriented language. For an example of how much thought our forebears were prepared to put into their literal formats when they had to be implemented on those, by current standards, minuscule machines. Syntax analysis. The syntax analysis can also profitably cut corners. In trying to arrive at a system that can process grammatical input, you do not actually need the full machinery to analyze the grammar from which you start. In fact, if you are willing to ignore a little junk, the grammar in Figure 5 can be parsed as an expression entirely via precedence climbing with the following syntax, being the binary operators of dollar and dot out being unary. Syntax analysis. All of these cases are good examples of a general principle that bootstrap when bootstrapping, because you are initially not creating the cathedral but merely putting up imperial scaffolding. You can save a good deal of effort by doing the unavoidable work in a quick and dirty manner, allowing you to do the desired work later in a proper manner. His paper takes two more steps in this manner, moving from Meta 2 to Balgor 1 to 2 in all the span of a few pages. Syntax analysis. Sure enough, his system was flexible enough to generate code in a language that would not even have been started until a quarter century later. Because of the additional levels for the import boilerplate and an expansion of AX2 to EX2 and EX25, so he could trivially express meta to sequential composition in Python as short circuit construction and identity. The Python generating meta to grammar grew to 33 lines instead of 30. This consistency of approximately 85 lines of code, developed largely by the mindless method of iteratively rerunning the program and implementing each operation as executed, reached the point where it became necessary. And here are the detailed findings. Well, note well the importance of self-reproduction here. It is not difficult to find self-referential systems. We may take the 1839 Jacquard one portrait depicting inventor Joseph Marie Jacquard seated at his workbench with a bunch of punched seats, or the frictional Baron pulling himself by his pigtail, rather than his bootstrapist derives almost all of his power, both in case of propagation and in case of extension, from being self-applicable. Now here is the conclusion. Finally, remember that Meta2 does not itself well to this kind of a sentence precisely because it was designed to be bootstrapped. As he says in his introduction, Meta2 is not intended as a standard language which everyone will use to write compilers. Rather, it is an example of a single working language which can give one good start in designing a compiler writing compiler situated to its own needs. Instead, the meta2 compiler is written in its own language, thus leading itself to modification. After all, barbarians may be perfectly adapted to their environment, but to be part of a civilization as it is to be aware of how people in other places at times have done things, and hence how much of one does oneself of essential and how much accidental. More specifically, civilized people have the luxury of learning from other people's mistakes. More specifically, for engineers faced with impairment requirements, it is often helpful to avoid the thinking of the code base at hand as a thing in itself and itself consider it only a particular installation of the classes of related possible programs. Thank you everybody for your time. Thank you.